Okay, taking up where we left off, the year is 1846. President Polk has failed in his efforts to open negotiations with any of the factions in Mexico to perhaps purchase California from Mexico. Now, nobody knows yet about the gold. That would have changed everything. So he found a way to pick a war with Mexico. Uh, he ordered General Zachary Taylor, general in the U.S. Army, to move his forces from the north bank of or the north end of the mouth of the Nueces River down to near the mouth of the Rio Grande River into the disputed area claimed by both the United States and Mexico. The American claim was quite dubious. Um, so, if you've ever been to the Texas State Aquarium at Corpus Christi, I'm told that's about where Taylor's men have been camped out. So they moved down to the Rio Grande, hoping that Mexico would send troops across the river to attack them. They didn't get the clue right away, and Polk had just about lost patience. In fact, he was working on a war message to Congress based on Mexico's dastardly refusal to discuss the issues with us. Plus, there's a matter of American citizens holding total debts of around $3.5 million from the Mexican government and citizens, I think, of that country. Anyway, eventually, Mexican troops did attack Taylor's men, two sharp little skirmishes, and that gave Polk what he'd been wanting. So he sends a message to Congress. Presidents through the entire 19th into the early 20th centuries did not ever go to Congress in person. They sent messages to be read by a clerk. Anyway, Polk informed Congress that American blood had been shed on American soil, and that in spite of all our sincerest efforts to avoid it, war had been forced upon us. Well, that's a bit wide of the mark, but anyway, it's not a precise quote, but it's the substance of it. So Congress, in a brief, I emphasize brief burst of enthusiasm, declared war on Mexico. And the Mexican Congress, with at least as much enthusiasm, declared war on the United States, boasting that they were not only going to regain Texas, they were going to invade the American South and free the slaves. Mexico, to its very great credit, had abolished slavery as far back as I think 1830 at least. Okay. So we get the Mexican-American War. This is not the mismatch you might expect. The difference in populations between the two countries wasn't that great. The Mexican army was actually larger than the United States Army and more experienced. They'd been fighting each other long enough. And it would be a road game for us. Okay, our wars up to then, that'd be the Revolution, some fighting against Indians time and again, and the War of 1812. Those had all been, to use a sports analogy, home games. And War of 1812, we were just glad to escape with our boundaries intact. So Europeans were just licking their chops. They resented us anyway, and now that Uncle Sam was about to get a way overdue spanking on this one. It didn't work out that way, as it turned out. It was a serious war, lasted about a year and a half, 2 years. The United States, by the late 1840s, had something it had not had in these previous wars, and that is a well-trained professional army. All right, we'd opened the military academy at West Point, New York, in about 1809, and graduates of there were like second lieutenants in the War of 1812. By the mid-1840s, from the command staff on down, they were professionalized, they had good equipment, they had fairly lightweight field artillery, which was highly mobile, and that made the difference in a number of battles. Okay, so it turned out to be surprisingly easy, and the supplement will give you enough information about the play-by-play on the war. It did feature an invasion of southern Mexico by General Winfield Scott, the first ever amphibious attack or landing on a beach in American military history. A brilliant campaign where it's waged over rough terrain against a powerful hostile enemy that outnumbered our troops, and Scott didn't even lose any battles. The Mexican forces were extremely patriotic, full of enthusiasm, but their weapons and tactics were outdated. They had a few too many ambitious generals wanting to make names for themselves by initiating lone wolf offensive operations independent of any larger plan. And in late 1847, Scott's troops marched into Mexico City. After reducing the mountain fortress of Chapultepec, you can read about that in the supplement. And they're still the boy heroes of Chapultepec are still highly respected in Mexican history. Well, the Mexican government did not have the stability to withstand that kind of shock. So, under very, very odd circumstances, negotiations commenced, resulting in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2nd, 1848, settled the war, settled some other stuff too. Mexico had already conceded Texas independence, but this time it accepted the Rio Grande as the legal border, and that's what makes it the legal border, and as such it's as legal as any other boundary in the world. Mexico also ceded, and it's a word starts with a C, we only use it when one government gives land to another, an enormous area from the Rio Grande all the way out to the Pacific coast. Okay, about a third of the present-day state of New Mexico, all of Arizona north of the Gila River, Nevada, California, those are the eventual states that were created. In exchange, the United States paid Mexico $15 million, deducting from that about $3.5 million owed to American citizens by Mexico. That makes us, as far as I know, the only conqueror in history to pay for a conquest after the fact. We would do the same thing about 50 years later when we relieved Spain of the Philippine Islands in the Western Pacific. Okay, so there you go. Now, so that's the third boundary dispute settled during Polk's tenure. It was highly portentous. Couple of things. Virtually everybody who was anybody in the Civil War, which was going on less than a decade and a half later, saw their first action in the Mexican War. Okay? The United States suffered around 13,000 casualties in the war. So there's that. But the main thing it did was reopen the question of slavery as a national issue. Okay? Now, slavery had been an issue for some time, but the Missouri Compromise back in 1820, people assumed had settled all questions that the federal government could answer about slavery, where there was this agreement that no more slave states could be created north of the southern boundary of Missouri. Technically, that's 36 degrees 30 minutes north latitude, which happens to be, by the way, the northern boundary of the Texas Panhandle for exactly the same reason. Okay. So, at that time, when they took the Constitution seriously, only a state government could make slavery legal or not. The federal government had no control over that. So there weren't any questions to be answered. And Congress just studiously avoided any such question, because I don't know if there's ever been a congressman that didn't look in the mirror and see a potential future president looking back at him. To get elected to that high office, you have to have lots and lots of votes from both North and South. And the slavery issue is a curveball that's going to kill you. Because if you defend it too much, you're dead in the North. If you're not solidly enough behind it, you're dead in the South. You don't want to have to vote on anything about slavery. But now we got all this new territory. The Missouri Compromise only applied to the land we had in 1819. And that we've got a lot more land since then. Now, Texas entered the Union as an uncontested slave state, which was part of the deal was Texas has had throughout its existence as a state standing permission from Congress to divide itself into as many as 5 states anytime we get ready. thing there is clear. Texas would be a kind of deck of cards where every time the South needs a new slave state, they would just cut a piece off of Texas and admit it to the Union. Okay, that Texas was never had enough population to support doing that. But what we got of the Oregon country, that's north of the line, that would be uncontested free state. But you got all this other stuff from Rio Grande out to the Pacific coast, referred to at the time as the Mexican cession. The cession is what was ceded. Okay, what about that? So that became an issue. Now, it very quickly became a very divisive North versus South issue. Southerners claimed access. The way this worked, could Southerners take their slaves into that area or not? All right. Southerners assumed that the entire area would be open to Southerners taking slaves out there. And Southerners, and this was a very different culture from our own, people could use words like this without embarrassment, that the South could claim it by right of conquest. Well, there's no such right today, but there was then. Why did they think that? Well, because roughly 70% of the officers and men of the regular army of the United States just happened to be Southerners. Virtually all of the thousands of volunteers who augmented the regular army were Southerners. Okay, the North had been sitting back criticizing. The Southerners had borne the heat of the battle and secured the area. Why should the Southerners be denied access to it? Well, a Northern congressman named David Wilmot attached a rider to a bill. I think it's known as the Wilmot Proviso. I don't know if that's proviso or proviso. I don't think it matters. Very densely worded, but the takeaway was that this would be reserved for free labor. In other words, if the Wilmot Proviso had become law, Southerners would not be able to take their slaves into that area. This became explosively controversial. There was already talk of breaking up the Union over it. So that goes through the year 1849 into the year 1850 and feeds into the Compromise of 1850. There's another thing. Something else interesting happened in California in 1848, in addition to coming under the U.S. flag. A man named Sutter, who had a outpost country store called Fort Sutter, Sutter's Mill, whatever it was, he discovered gold in 1848. Okay. Of course, he's unable to secure a claim, ends up dying penniless. It always works that way. But this touches off the great California gold rush that gets into high gear in 1849 and beyond. Now, this was not a false alarm, all right? Turns out that more gold was mined in California in the single decade of the 1850s than had been mined in the whole planet for the last 2 centuries combined. This is what's going to make the United States a cash-rich country. So it's huge. So in the year 1849 alone, it's estimated something like 100,000 fortune seekers made their way to California at a time when that was a very daunting thing. Trekking across the continent from, say, western Missouri could take 6 months at extreme risk and hazard. A few people could ride a boat down to Panama, trek across the isthmus, come up by another boat the other side. Even smaller number could book passage on a clipper ship that would go all the way through the Strait of Magellan, south end of Argentina, back up the other side to San Francisco. That would be 11,000 miles, almost halfway around the planet. Against all those obstacles, 100,000 people made it out there, mainly single men gold seekers. And by the end of the year, since California has no government of any kind, it's unorganized territory, roughly 1 out of every 5 of these gold seekers had died by violence. It's out of control. So responsible elements in California, and one wonders whatever happened to them. Well, they petitioned Congress for admission as a state without even waiting around to be organized as a territory. And we'll take this up in the next video.